Hello, and welcome to another episode of the ITPro Podcast. My name's Adam Shepherd, and I'm joined once again by staff writer Keumars Afifi-Sabet, who is filling in for Jane while she's on holiday. Keumars, welcome back to the show.
Hi Adam, glad to be back.
So, how has your week been, Keumars? It's been a bit of a weird one on all fronts once again.
Well, another day in paradise, another week in paradise. Yeah, it's been a bit funny because of the bank holiday, to be honest. It's kind of wrecked my internal clock. I found myself around about Saturday, Sunday thinking, back to work again on Monday. And then Monday came around and I had nothing to do.
I had the exact same feeling. It's the first bank holiday in ages that's felt like a proper break. It's weird that it took a quarantine for a bank holiday to actually feel like a holiday, but there you go, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, at least the sun's shining. I suppose that's a good or a bad thing, depending on your perspective at the minute, though.
I think it more or less depends on whether you have a garden or not. Fortunately, I'm in the lucky position to have a bit of outdoor space, so yeah, managed to get out there and enjoy it a little bit. So, speaking of weather, IT professionals have had a bit of unusual weather themselves in the form of a veritable rain of patches. IT pros have been inundated with more than 500 security patches as part of a massive so-called Fujiwara Effect.
This so-called Fujiwara Effect is named after the phenomenon where two cyclones collide to presumably create a massive supercyclone.
In the context of IT, the Fujiwara Effect comes when major vendors all release a multitude of security patches and fixes at the same time. Now, in this case, the culprits are Microsoft and Oracle. Microsoft has patched more than 100 vulnerabilities as part of a bumper Patch Tuesday effort, including 3 0 days which are actively being exploited by attackers in the wild.
If that's not enough, Oracle has issued patches for over 400 flaws as part of its latest quarterly security update, coinciding with Microsoft and presumably a bunch of other vendors as well.
The grand total for Microsoft and Oracle alone comes to more than 500, which represents a major job for IT admins who are going to have to patch products from both companies. This comes amidst one of the most challenging business climates in history, what with coronavirus and the lockdowns and with multiple IT departments up and down the country running on severely reduced staffing and cash resources. It's going to be a really big job to get all of these patches implemented in a timely manner.
Yeah, it's a staggering number of patches. I mean, if you go back to the predictions last week, the forecasts, I should say. The researchers looking at this estimated the upper end of the number of patches coming our way would be around 500. So we're well over that. And that's just these two companies. They were estimating initially around between 300 to 500 among probably around a dozen companies. So this is an absolutely monstrous number of patches, which, as you said, is quite a beast to tackle considering we're all working from home. Resources are scarce. Companies are basically trying to stay alive at the minute, let alone patch their critical systems.
And speaking of critical systems, as always, businesses are advised to focus on the most critical infrastructure when rolling out these patches. But that does not mean that the so-called non-critical applications should be neglected once the critical patches are in place.
Yeah, it's not an excuse to basically kick the can down the road. It's important to keep on top of this.
In other news, Slack CEO Stuart Butterfield has this week been taking potshots at Microsoft's claims around the growth of its Teams software.
Yes, well, as we've seen with Teams, with Slack, and a host of other vendors, collaboration software has experienced a massive growth since coronavirus sparked global lockdowns. Teams, if you pardon the pun, are now working from home en masse. And Microsoft, in particular, has claimed that its Teams software has passed 44 million users.
That's right. Butterfield, on the other hand, has disputed how impressive these metrics actually are. He's argued that given that Office 365 has 200 million customers or so, a user base of 44 million only represents an adoption rate of around 20%. Teams, of course, is included by default with Office 365 subscriptions. It's free of charge for any Office 365 customers at the enterprise level, we should say. So a 20% adoption rate, in his view, is not quite as impressive given all of those factors.
No, and it's funny that that Butterfield's made this pot shot now, considering Microsoft's not had the smoothest ride with these statistics over the last few weeks, and I'm referring obviously to its claim that it's experienced a 775% surge in Azure usage. It turned out afterwards that it was just in Italy, and it was just with Teams in Italy, and not the whole of Azure. So I guess it's a way of continuing this weird beef that the two companies have sustained over the last year or so.
And this is despite the fact that the two actually have worked together on an integration which allows Slack users to call Teams users from within Slack. So it's not like they're completely incompatible with each other. It's very strange.
Yeah, then they're not. They are in a way competing, but there is a degree of integration. I suppose there's an element of pride here. I'm not too sure, but this exchange of barbs the two companies have been going through goes back to I think it was the start of last year, where Teams started to release its total user base figures. As and when it eclipsed Slack, and continued to do so for some time afterwards. So there is some history there.
The rivalry is almost certainly going to continue, but truth be told, Slack and Teams both serve slightly different niches. Teams for Microsoft customers, existing Microsoft shops, is a bit of a no-brainer. You know, it's, as we mentioned, it's included by default in the Office 365 subscription. It integrates rather naturally with the rest of Microsoft's products, and it's easier to integrate for IT teams that are already well versed in Microsoft's stack, for want of a better word. Slack, on the other hand, is best suited to organizations that want to pick and choose from different SaaS providers. Companies that are using G Suite, for example, tend to gravitate towards Slack due to its strong integrations with G Suite, as well as the fact that they don't have to waste money on additional components that they're not going to be using.
Yeah, and in some respect, Butterfield does have a point. Just going back to your comment there, I think it makes perfect sense to remain, well, from an organisational point of view, to keep your employees within the same ecosystem. If you're using Microsoft products, then Teams is kind of a no-brainer, as you mentioned. So he does have a point. A 20% adoption rate for Office 365 customers isn't high, but I suppose not everyone needs to use software like Teams. It's not for everyone in that sense.
Well, quite. And in our final story of the week, campaigners are once again at war over the controversial digital services tax, which came into force earlier this month. Now, Keumars, you've been following this story quite closely. What is it that people are so het up about?
Well, this is something that, if you remember Philip Hammond, he used to be Chancellor, he introduced in 2018 in the budget. It's it's an additional levy on revenues beyond the existing corporation tax, targeting a host of internet companies, internet giants specifically. So we're talking about big names like Google, Facebook, Amazon. They aren't referenced explicitly in any of the legislation or any of the additional government material, but their types of businesses are highlighted in particular as being the sort of companies that are going to be targeted by this. As for what the major points of contention are, in all honesty, there hasn't been many people actually criticizing this tax in the same way that you might have had a lot of criticism for the IR35 legislation, for instance. It's mostly broader arguments around what such a tax might mean for investment, for passing costs on to other parts of the supply chain. So Tech UK, the trade association, has been arguing against this on behalf of their representatives, which a lot of these companies will naturally fall under.
Yeah, so Tech UK is arguing that all the liabilities under the new tax should be deferred until next year amidst the ongoing crisis. Now, this is on the basis that businesses currently don't have the spare resources to devote to establishing whether or not they're actually liable for the tax. For a company to be liable, their global revenues must be over 500 million, and 25 million of that revenue must be coming from UK users.
I suppose they're doing this off the back of the delay to the IR35 legislation, because, and a host of other measures, I'm sure, because of course there's, widespread economic disruption expected as a result of the pandemic, and that will definitely have an effect on company staffing, resources, and so on. As for the ins and outs of their arguments, I can't actually speak to whether or not they have much merit, but the tax has already come into effect. It's not as if the legislation hasn't been passed or anything. So it might be difficult to delay the collection of this in such a way. I'm not too sure.
Tech UK's main argument is around deferment of collection and of the liabilities rather than for the tax itself to be scrapped. But tax justice campaigners have dismissed the claims of Tech UK and others, stating that the objections are simply a way for tech firms to dodge the obligations to pay their fair share. Big tech giants, particularly the US-based tech giants that we've already mentioned, have a reputation for paying perhaps less than they, strictly speaking, should be in taxes, to put it somewhat charitably. Authorities across the EU, most notably France, have been particularly vociferous in complaining about the tax revenues, or lack thereof, from the giants who have offices in their countries. Many EU countries, and indeed the EU itself as a governing body, have imposed investigations and such like on the tax affairs of these companies in an attempt to, as they see it, right the imbalance.
Yeah, it goes to the heart of why we're seeing this tax introduced in the first place. And yeah, the UK is not alone. France has a similar tax, very similar, in fact, to this one, to this digital services tax. And yeah, if we look at why the government felt a need to introduce such a tax in the first place, if you look at the almost industrial scale of tax minimization, I should add probably that in all, if not most cases, legally, if you look at the minimal amounts of tax revenues collected through the conventional corporation tax, there is an element of injustice there, which is at the heart of why this tax is being introduced. So campaigners are essentially saying there's absolutely no reason to defer such a tax, because if you look in the context and in the grand scheme of things, this is only a fraction of the amount of tax that should have been paid anyway, based on the spirit of the law, not necessarily the letter of it, though.
It'll be interesting to see how this particular argument shakes out. Now it's time for us to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to be talking to Red Hat's Erica Langhi about cloud-native development and how organizations can architect their applications for public and hybrid cloud.
See you in a few.
Welcome back. We're now joined by Erica Langhi, Senior Solutions Architect at open source giant Red Hat, who's here to talk about cloud-native applications, why they're so important for modern business, and how organizations can start cloudifying their development cycles. Erica, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, cloud is far from a new trend in the IT world, but it's been rapidly evolving over the past few years. In your view, what have been the biggest recent changes?
Yeah, I think what we are seeing is basically that now containers and containers orchestration are kind of widely adopted. So we are definitely seeing more technologies coming to provide more services to the cloud. And I think that one of the areas is trying to simplify development and deployment in the cloud, trying to make the experience simpler for everyone. So if we see some trends also like in 2020, they are all with the same common goal of trying to simplify this type of development. I'm thinking about like areas like a serverless, for instance, or service mesh or GitOps. They're all common in this kind of objective. If we think about serverless, for instance, as a term that highlights the fact that, in a sense, the end user doesn't need to think about the managing of the servers, but just focusing on the code. But reality is that it's basically a way to execute code using only the specific amount of computing resources that are needed to complete that task. So we're seeing like a kind of a predefined event occurring that triggers the code, and then the serverless platform executes the task. So for me, that is an example of the abstraction that is and the elasticity that is actually needed to help with a cloud native strategy.
So, Erica, when we look at cloud native development, what do you think are the most important factors? Do you think the technology is at the heart of it, or rather the mindset is more important?
I would say both, actually. Technologies are important, definitely.
A bit of both.
Because, yeah, absolutely, a little bit of both. When you look at technologies, actually, you are developing applications in a different way compared to the traditional, say, on-premise applications. Because you want to exploit like the advantages of the cloud computing model. You want to use the elasticity, you want to use the scalability, you want to use those features, and so you need to have different technologies in place. But at the same time, I believe that there's also a kind of a cultural shift or cultural adoption component that needs to be considered. And again, this is because if we think about this cloud native development, you want to develop applications faster and deploy applications faster. So your traditional development and IT operations teams, they need to work in a different way. They need to work more in a kind of a collaborative way. And it's also a different approach in terms of trying to, challenge yourself in order to develop and rethink your skills, because the market for cloud native is basically constantly evolving. So you need to kind of keep an eye open for new tools, new technologies, and this is vital, I believe, for the cloud native strategy. I think, coming from Red Hat as well, open source, in terms of the open source innovation, is at the heart of a cloud native adoption.
So what are the foundational tools that organizations should be looking at when it comes to cloud native development?
I would say, a fundamental tool is to consider is certainly DevOps. And that is, again, a set of tools like, the configuration management, the version control, the test and automation, the CI/CD, type of tools. But it's also, again, a set of principles and values. So again, when you working with DevOps, in a sense, you're thinking about the willingness and the trust of the teams to have this more integrated and collaborative approach, which encourages like the feedback and the experimentation, if you want, as well with the new technologies. From the specific also technical point of view, in addition to DevOps, it's important to recognize that the applications running on the cloud, they need to be built in a different way compared to, traditional on-premise applications. So ideally, a cloud native application is a set of like small, granular, independent, loosely coupled as well microservices deployed in Linux containers and connected through APIs. So I would say that these, from the technical point of view, are the building blocks to keep in mind.
Speaking of on-premise applications, would you suggest the best way is to retrofit existing software or redevelop it from scratch?
So ideally, you would want to analyze your on-premise application and take some time to refactor the application to run as containers, maybe under a microservices architecture. And this is actually the place where you can get the greater agility, the greater performance when we move the application from on-premise to the cloud. Having said that, not necessarily all the applications are suitable to the cloud, because if you have, for instance, an application that tends to have a workloads that drop and spike, that's a good candidate for the cloud because it can easily be scaled up and down. Other applications, they may not have these features, so they may still run on premise, and you can be perfectly happy with that. So I think again, ideally you want to do an analysis, kind of a planning and design, in order to think about what's best, what type of workloads can be suitable for the cloud. Because to be honest, the cloud adoption is a gradual process. It's a learning experience. And we know that most organizations, they have established IT environments that use on-premise applications. And so it's unrealistic to think that they suddenly align all the systems and all the platforms into a new architecture. So again, I think to me, it's a question of analyzing the different applications and see if there's a way to rewrite them or not.
So we've talked about on-premise and cloud native, but the reality of a lot of organizations' IT, for the reasons you just described, is going to be a hybrid approach because, as you mentioned, many applications just aren't suitable for the cloud. So does hybrid cloud mean that organizations who have gone all in on cloud native will need to somewhat rethink their development strategies?
Yeah, I would say that certainly development strategies, they need to evolve. As you mentioned, a hybrid environment brings a lot of advantages and flexibility, but also raises like kind of a unique concerns around, say, security or management or governance. So to me, it's like when you adopt the hybrid cloud, you want to understand what is the best fit for your workload, whether it's one or two cloud providers or your own data center. So in order to do that, you may want to understand the APIs or the services that a specific cloud provider can offer. And if possible, also try to adopt open standards, because that will give you the type of flexibility to migrate your workloads as well from one cloud provider to the other. And adopting all these features and capabilities means also that you are introducing a level of agility in your development strategy. So automatically, your development strategy has shifted.
Speaking of these aspects and these factors that companies need to bear in mind, are there any major pitfalls that organizations should be aware of?
I would say that, one area to consider and one pitfall is you try maybe to do too much. The cloud adoption is kind of a journey. It's made of different steps, incremental steps. And so, instead of trying to do everything at the beginning, a suggestion would be to try to start with maybe a proof of concept, a small project. And that means that you're taking small steps and you have the ability to understand some of the challenges you may face at scale. So with a small project, you are investigating errors or issues. You have the ability to resolve them, and then to do also a learning process before taking a bigger step. Another pitfall, I would say, is like, running the applications exactly the same way you would run them on premise and doing the same things, like in terms of also processes and best practices. Again, if we think about a cloud native adoption, you need to think about agile methodologies or DevOps, because you need that type of change. And this model, which is associated to a rapid prototyping, also a faster development, fits well with the concept of the cloud computing itself and the microservices, because you enable maybe a small team to own a full service and to be responsible for that. And I think the last pitfall is the vendor locking. So the cloud offers a lot of opportunities, from the greater flexibility, the ability to scale, but with the transition you also need to be very careful about locking. You want to understand, again, the specific services or APIs offered by a specific cloud provider, the ability that you have to migrate your data from one cloud provider to the next. So yeah, you need to consider all the options that you have to make sure that you're really leveraging this flexibility offered by the cloud model.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week. Thank you once again, Erica, for joining us to talk about cloud and the virtues of cloud native development.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
You can find links to all the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website at www.itpro.co.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn, and you can get in contact with us by emailing podcast@itpro.co.uk.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. And we'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.